Good day. You know, normally I do a lot of travel around the world and I have to like think about how to say the greeting. So fortunately this one was very, very easy. It's fantastic to be here. This is my first time in this part of the world, so I'm really, really excited. I have, many times before, I've been offered opportunities to come here, particularly for TechEd Australia and New Zealand, but never actually took up the offer. So I was really excited when I found that I'd have the opportunity to come here and speak to you today. I thought I'd tell a quick tale. Ian, well, first off, he's very persistent. I have to say that for him. Last year, my friend Phil Hack came here, and he told me, hey, I'm going to this really cool conference called Codemania. It sounds awesome. And I was jealous, and I was like, I want to go to that conference. So I contacted Ian. I'm like, do you have room for somebody else? And he said, no, I don't have room this year, but you know, we'll keep in touch for the future. And then he contacted me, and he's like, hey, would you like to go next year? And I had a lot of stuff going on, and I said, yeah, I don't know. And then he contacted me again, and then he contacted me again, and he was really, really persistent. And I really wanted to go. It was just there were many different things that were going on. But fortunately, here I am, really excited to be here with you guys. It looks like a great conference and a great turnout. So just a quick thing about me. So I am a software development fanatic. I started programming when I was 7 on a VIC-20. For those of you guys, how many people here remember Commodore VIC-20? Yep. 4.77 megahertz with an 8K expansion card. A lot's happened since then. That was BASIC, GW BASIC. Oh, that was actually just BASIC. And in those days, with the VIC-20, we would like reprogram the character sets, and you know that was how I learned binary, reprogramming fonts and changing characters and things like that. That was fun. So I've been pretty much developing my whole life. I always laugh about that because back in the day when the startup crashes happened, you know, there were all these news articles where they were saying how people were returning back to their day jobs. And I'm like, well, I don't have another option. I'm just stuck. I'm going to be a coder, or I'm going to be out of work with a coding sign saying, we'll code for food, which fortunately did not happen. So I really love software development, and you know, I heard Ian talking about work-life balance and these kind of things, and don't work through the night. And I'm not in a place where Microsoft, the company that I work for, tells me, hey, you have to work through the night, but I work through the night anyway, because I just love coding. I love developing software. I have a good friend, Kelly Summers, Kilobyte. How many people here have heard of Kilobyte on Twitter? Yeah, she's pretty insane. She, you know, wrote this blog post about her passion for software development and how she just has to like get up and code and really love, you know, it's addicting. It really is an addicting industry if you love it. I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's definitely the truth for me. So you will find me at any hour of the day, probably not sleeping, but tweeting or coding or blogging or speaking. So I love developing software. And another thing that I really love is open source. And that may sound strange for those of you who know that I work at Microsoft. You may be saying, well, how could somebody who loves open source work at Microsoft? And I'm going to talk to you a bit about how and what's happened at Microsoft. I think the tides really are changing at Microsoft towards open source. And I've been one of a bunch of people who've really been kind of waving the flag over the last, I've been at Microsoft for about 7 years. And I really started caring about open source at Microsoft about 6 years ago. Actually, I've been about 7.5. And so I've been waving this flag, constantly trying to push the bar with other people. I'm not the only one. Getting some bruises along the way, but we've made a lot of progress. And so first, I want to show you my flag. This is my flag right here. It's a little bit tattered, but it's still strong. So I'm happy to say that things really are changing around open source at Microsoft. We're actually learning. You could even, some might say you could give us an achievement award for the things that we're doing. And what have we learned? I think one of the things we've learned is that a lot of people that work with Microsoft Platform actually want to use open source. How many people here actually want to use open source with Microsoft Platform? A few? A bunch? Okay, hopefully that number is going to grow. So we've heard customers saying, hey, we want to be able to use open source. And I think what we've actually learned is, well, hey, that's okay. And we can actually support it. We can develop things in an open source fashion and develop open source. And we can actually use open source. And so part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is not just what we're doing around making things available as open source, but also our own efforts internally to actually adopt it and use it. And I think lastly, we learned that open source is not the enemy. And you can have a business. You can have a business where open source plays a key part in that business. And I think Microsoft is learning that now. And I think that the cloud is actually helping us in a lot of ways. And I'll talk about that as well. So I thought I would start off and just give some of my own history around working with open source. A lot of my entry into open source came through the .NET community, but it has since expanded out, in particular the last few years. So one of the lessons I want to talk about is about supporting open source tools. So around 2007, I joined this team at Microsoft called the Patterns and Practices team. Anybody here heard of Patterns and Practices? Okay, so Patterns and Practices would put out a lot of guidance around how to work with the Microsoft platform. And PMP was very open to at least looking at what was going on in the open source world, looking at patterns like MVC and MVP and looking at things like IOC containers and saying, hey, we need something like that on the Microsoft platform. And a lot of people coming even from like the Java world would land in Patterns and Practices and they would look at the guidance and say, oh, this is cool. They're trying to do the same kind of things that we can do. But what happened was there was this group that sprung up right around the time when I joined PMP called Alt.NET. And Alt.NET was a group that was really kind of criticizing Microsoft heavily and saying that Microsoft is reinventing everything that's out there in open source. They're not actually embracing what's out there in their own ecosystem, which we had a .NET open source ecosystem. And the other thing that people were complaining about was that our tools were too heavyweight. And PMP in particular, the team that I was on, I had, anybody here heard of the composite application block? Great experiences you've had there? So I came in as the person to lead that. But the damage had already been done before I joined, in my defense. But I picked up the cab and I had to take the cab forward. And that was one of the first places they started to bash. And, you know, because the Alt.NET community started to list out examples. And they're like, and the first one is this cab thing. This thing is horrible. It's reproducing a lot of what's out there and it's very complicated. We want lightweight ways of doing things. We want to work with test-driven development, et cetera. So for me, the lesson there was really, hey, you know, we need to think about what we're building. And Patterns and Practices, to be fair, it was not the .NET framework. It was guidance. But a lot of customers didn't care. They just looked at it like, here's a library from Microsoft with some guidance associated with it. So I saw this Alt.NET thing, and I was like, you know, everything these guys say they stand for about using good practices and patterns and tools is something that we should care about. So I got involved with the Alt.NET community, and not everybody loved that. You know, initially there was, this is Oren Aney, the guy who wrote, he wrote RhinoMox and a bunch of other things. He's also the author of RavenDB. And he had some very strong criticisms about our stuff, and I reached out to him and I said, look, you know, I'm not saying that absolutely everything you're saying we're going to do something about, but at least I'll listen. I'll listen to what you have to say. And he was very open to that. And I also, you know, fought back a little bit, so it's kind of a mutual relationship there. But the Alt.NET community itself was also kind of a mix. There were people that were very, very critical about Microsoft and Microsoft being involved at all. And then there were other people that really were supportive and were like, hey, this is great to see a bunch of people like Scott Hanselman and et cetera, Scott Guthrie, engaging and trying to figure out what this community is talking about and how we can take that information and use it to kind of evolve our platform. So for me, what that translated into was this project that later became known as Prism, which was called the Composite Application Guidance. And Prism was kind of the predecessor, not the predecessor, it's the successor to CAB, the Composite Application Block. And so one of the things we did differently in terms of learning is when we went out to build Prism, we said, hey, you know what? There's all these other IRC containers out there now. There are about 10 of them. Let's make it so that whatever we do with Prism will work with all those different IRC containers. And so one of the ways I drove that was I had the team actually building Prism using one of those IRCs. This way there was no way that we could take a hard dependency on anything that we built internally. And so I went and mined a lot of my old blog posts for this talk. And so this here is a unit test that says Prism should not reference Unity. So we actually had a unit test that enforced that there was no way that we could take this hard dependency on something that would break the ability for people to use their own open source libraries. And I tweeted it, as you can tell, even back then I was tweeting a little bit like crazy. So I think this was a great thing because it got received really well that, hey, you know, Microsoft is consciously going out of their way to say that we're going to embrace the other libraries that are out there and allow people to use them. This is just one example. This is my own personal example, but there are... They're not hearing me? Can you hear me now? Were you not hearing me at all? Okay. So this is just an example of something we did to try to adjust to what we were hearing from the community. And then what happened as a result is we found that people created adapters in Prism for almost every IOC that was out there. So that was a very positive net result of making open source work by embracing what was already out there in the .NET community. Then I moved from the Patterns and Practices team to this team called the Managed Extensibility Framework. So I got the chance to go from PMP, actually work on the .NET framework, which was a really exciting time for me. And the Managed Extensibility Framework was like this extensibility library. So this was the logo that I first bought when I first joined the team as a way of showing, like, this is what MEF will do for you. It will help you to compose your applications. And I came really fired up from PMP saying, hey, we're going to go open source. There's going to be some way that we're going to make this thing go open source. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I was just like, it's going to happen. So I fought and fought hard, and I managed to get some support, fortunately, from the high level to say, yeah, let's put this code out there. But one of the things that Microsoft struggles with open source is this IP thing. You know, IP protection. How do we ensure that when we put code out there, we're not releasing patents and other things that we have protected, or we're not going to get sued, or these kind of things? And the challenge with MEF actually was that many teams had contributed to it. It wasn't just one team. It had started off as a project in another part of the company, and then it had moved over and we had taken it over. But I was just not hearing that. I was just like, we got to go, we got to get this source out there. And I made the argument that the risk was really low. Like, MEF was kind of an edge technology, so it wasn't going to be the thing that everybody was going to be using, though it was actually used as part of Visual Studio. So it was still something pretty serious. And now it's used very, very heavily by a lot of our tooling and by a lot of folks using the .NET framework. So why do I have the Mono logo up there? Well, so after the big fight, you know, I finally got support to say, OK, we're going to put this thing out on Codeplex. And this is where I started to learn a license lesson, because when we put it out there on Codeplex, you know, whenever you're putting source and you're making source available, you've got to think about what's the license going to be. And so because of all of these debates we had back and forth, it kind of ended up that, hey, we're going to use this license called MSLPL, which is the Microsoft Limited Permissive License. And somebody wasn't too happy about that. That was Miguel de Icaza of the Mono Project. And he wrote a very nice post here, avoid the Managed Extensibility Framework. Those were fun times indeed. And I really remember this one because I was on Twitter and I was tweeting about MEF. And suddenly I get this tweet from this guy, Miguel de Icaza, who I knew who he was. And he tells me, you know, don't use MEF it's poison. And I said, thanks, I'm the PM on the team. And then I learned a lesson in keep your mouth shut, because I said a few things after that to try to say, well, we're not the only project that's on Codeplex that has an MSLPL license or that has a non-open source license. Because his argument, he had two arguments that he was making. The first argument that he was making was that MEF should not be on Codeplex because Codeplex is only for open source projects. The second point he was making was we should not call it open source because of the fact that it's not going to work on Mono. So those were fun times indeed. And that was the first time I really got to meet our legal folks. Yeah, that was fun. And you know what was great about it, though, and I give Miguel a lot of credit because I think a lot of Microsoft's progress around open source has not been without the help of the community. It would not be possible. Even what I showed with like the alt.NET example, which was a very small one with Prism, it was the fact that there were people there that were supportive and that were willing to help us. And Miguel actually bashing us made me really happy because I felt this was going to come to a head. It was either going to get us to a place where we could release this thing under open source, or it was going to cause, you know, I felt it was actually going to help us, not hurt us. It turned out actually to help us. Miguel, it turned out, had a pretty good connection with Bob Muglia, who was a very senior person at Microsoft. And I think everybody reviewed it, and they were like, and I made my claims for why I thought we should do it. And then, boom, it went to MSPL, which was the Microsoft Permissive License, which was, at that time, an OSI-ratified OSS license that Microsoft had created. So that was a huge thing. And then MEF got incorporated into Mono, which I was really excited about. And that was like a great example for me of why it was worth it to kind of stick to my guns and fight that fight because of the fact that we got to a place where it actually was released under open source. So that was pretty exciting. The last story I want to tell you about is a recent one, and I think it's a great story. And this one, there were no bruises, but I think we went about it the right way, which was good, is the way we engaged around Node.js with the Node community. So how many people here are familiar with Node.js? Okay, Node.js, server-side JavaScript. It's a very new thing. It's now been around about 3 years. It's not so new anymore. So Node is something that completely existed in open source, built by the open source community, Ryan Dahl, the author, and it was not really even built to work well on Windows. It only worked on Linux. It was built on the POSIX OS, so it worked on Linux. It could work on Mac. And we saw an opportunity there that, hey, this doesn't work on Windows. It doesn't work well. There are customers that are using it. They're using Cygwin, which is an adapter for being able to run Linux things on Windows or Unix things on Windows. And what I think is great here is we actually engaged with the community and actively got involved to contribute back to open source, to make Node work well on Windows. And we actually had a full-time employee who worked with the Node team, the Node core team, to actually get libuv, which is an abstraction layer, in Node, built and supporting Windows. So why I think that's really great is because it's one thing to take code and put it out there and let other people see it and use it. It's another thing to actively contribute to the success of an open source project, which is not something that Microsoft created, and it's not something that traditionally would have happened. So all of this, in my mind, like looking at just my little tales of things, and I've been very involved with this project in particular about bringing Node to work in our cloud, Windows Azure. And there, I would say that I think we also did it right. We went to the Node community very early on and said, hey, this is what we want to do, and help us. Help us do the right thing here. And so I would say that a big part about being successful with open source is just about being visible, being honest, being genuine, being friendly. All these things have helped us, I think, in our path towards open source. So anyway, that kind of concludes my tales. And what came out of that is now if you go to nodejs.org, you can download Node for Windows. And we've now see real serious adoption happening of Node on Windows. So I think that's a really good sign of where things are going. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is if we look at OSS and what is happening at Microsoft, so I gave a couple of small examples. There are a ton of projects at Microsoft that are now fully operating as open source projects. And I listed some of them that are here. And one of the things I think we learned even with licensing is that even though Microsoft put a lot of efforts in to create an open source license, a lot of people didn't trust it. A lot of people felt, why does Microsoft need this new license? Even if it was actually nothing wrong with it, it's all about perception. Perception is reality. So one of the things you'll notice about all of these projects here is they're not using MSPL. They're Apache 2. So we're really trying to embrace the licenses that already exist rather than saying, hey, you need to just believe us that this license is an open source license. Just use the licenses that you know. So SignalR is a kind of new framework that we have for doing real-time communication in .NET, supports WebSockets, things like that. What's interesting about SignalR is it's actually a project that started as a side project. Two guys on my team, David Fowler and Damian Edwards, went off and they built this project, open source. And now Microsoft is embracing it. But they've been a fully open source project, accepting contributions, et cetera. And what is really interesting, I think, now is that we are actually not just putting our source out there, but we're actually starting to take back contributions and ship code that other people are authoring that are not Microsoft employees. Now, for those of you that come from outside the Microsoft world, that might not sound like a big thing, but if you've been in the Microsoft world, that is a huge thing. Those are the kind of things we did not do before. That, to me, is an indication of progress, that the work that we're all doing is actually yielding benefits. We've recently released a whole bunch of other parts of our stack too, like ASP.NET Web API, ASP.NET MVC. These are all open source projects available on Codeplex using Apache 2 licenses. Then there's Newget. How many people here are familiar with Newget? So Newget, I mean, if you want to talk about, we'll just jump over here. You want to talk about a contribution to really help the open source community in .NET, I think it's Newget. Because Newget is now putting Microsoft libraries and open source libraries on equal footing from a discoverability perspective. That as a developer, it's making it really easy to get those open source libraries out there and get them on the same box as where somebody is actually using Microsoft technology. And Microsoft is actually starting to ship a lot of our stuff out of band on Newget, just like the open source community is doing. So I think that that has actually been another example of a great project. And Newget is not actually a Microsoft project. It is a fully open source project that is in the Outer Curve Foundation. Now, we have a Microsoft employee who's a project owner. But he's doing that, and the setup there is basically that, yes, he's involved on the project, but it is not a Microsoft project. And the community is actively contributing to the success of Newget. How many people here actually use it? Okay, good number of you. So, and do you feel that it's helping the ability for you to consume and use open source within your organizations? Is this more for personal, or is this within your companies? Both? And do you feel like the tide is changing, like it's actually helping? Awesome. Another one on that list is one that I only recently had a nice little education about, is F#. So how many people are familiar here with F#? Did you know that F# is actually a language that Microsoft created that is now fully under an open source license, and the community is actively contributing to take F# forward? I think this is awesome. You go to fsharp.org, you'll see that F# now works on Mono. It works on all other platforms, not just Windows. The Xamarin guys have even gotten it now where you can use it on Android and iOS. And here's an example of a core language at Microsoft that is now really being taken forward from the community. I think that's a huge testament to where things are going with open source at Microsoft. And then I wanted to drop a mention of the Azure SDK, which is a team that I work on. So we've been really trying to take Azure. And I mentioned how I think the cloud is really changing the way Microsoft thinks about open source. How many people here know that you can run Linux VMs in Azure? Just a few. Does that sound surprising? that you could run Linux in Microsoft's cloud. This is part of the change that I believe the cloud is bringing to Microsoft. Because the cloud is really about enabling as many people as possible to run their workloads. And for us, it's a very pragmatic decision. The more stacks that we can support in Azure, the more likely we are to have people come to it. Now, people may look at that and say, oh, well, yeah, you're only doing that because you're making money. It doesn't matter. The reality of the fact is that having this kind of business imperative of making the cloud succeed for Microsoft is forcing us in a direction that is opening us up. And I actually see that as much better than just a champion coming along and saying, hey, let's do open source, because tomorrow that champion can go away. But the fact that Microsoft's business model is now evolving around open source, and we're finding open source a key to our success, I think is really promising in terms of the role that open source is going to play within the Microsoft stack going forward. And we are going further than just about enabling .NET to use open source. We're actually actively supporting open source stacks now. So on the Azure SDK team, which is the team that I work on, we are making sure you can deploy PHP, you can deploy Python and Django, you can deploy Node.js. With our VMs, you can deploy Ruby on Rails on Linux. So we really are going very far, I think, in the direction of embracing and supporting open source in our stack. And I want to show you guys something cool that you may not know about. We actually now have a new website called VM Depot. And VM Depot is done by a group at Microsoft called MS OpenTech. And MS OpenTech is basically like a subsidiary of Microsoft that was established specifically for contributing back to open source projects. That is where the node work has happened. And so if you go to VM Depot, you will see that this is actually community-contributed images for running different OSS stacks on Windows Azure, like Solar Lucene, Ruby Stack, React. I mean, this is, I think, really great stuff. OK. GitHub. So Microsoft has an open source repository called Codeplex. But as we've started to move more into these open source stacks, we've seen that, hey, guess what? That's not where all the developers are. We're trying to attract Node developers. We're trying to attract PHP developers, Python developers. These people are all on GitHub. So we are now sharing the source, like, for example, for our Azure SDK. That is on GitHub. That is not on Codeplex. We have an Azure Node module, which allows Node developers to be able to access Windows Azure right from within their Node apps. That's on GitHub. And not only is it on GitHub, and we're embracing sharing our source on GitHub, but we're accepting contributions. So you can go to our project just like any other open source project. You can send us patches for bugs. You can even do features. It's a little bit more challenging, I think, when you're a big company. For Microsoft, we still have concerns over things like IP. For bugs, it's not a big issue. Pretty much, if you're coming with a bug fix, there's very little reason that we won't take it. If there are features, there is work that we have to do to make sure that there's no IP violations or patent violations, like you're not contributing code to our code base that maybe you took from somewhere else. So we do some work there. We're not the only ones that do this. We do some diligence there. But again, it puts you in a place now where, one, you don't have to be blocked because you have access to the source. Two, you can actually contribute back when you fix problems, and you can help the rest of the community that are using those libraries. And not only are we embracing the libraries, we're embracing the tool chains that open source developers like to use. We've seen a lot of open source developers telling us, hey, we live in Git. We like to use Git. We like to use Mercurial. So Microsoft is now embracing Git and Mercurial and these other mechanisms as part of our experiences. So for example, when you go to deploy to Windows Azure, you can use Git deployment. You can just create a Git repo or link to GitHub. So this is really about not so much shipping libraries, but really embracing the tools that open source developers are using to get things done. Victory. So I don't think we're done. There's a lot of work that we can still do. But I think we're making major progress. And I want to thank the community for the support that they've given us to get to where we are. But we're definitely not done. There's more work to do. And we're open, and we want the feedback on how to take things forward even further. And if you're not using open source within your organizations, you should. I'm standing here and telling you, you should be able to use it. Now, one of the things that people will ask is, hey, if Microsoft is shipping something that's open source, can I use it? What kind of support guarantees do I get? This is a very common question. The things that we ship in the box that are open source, we support them just as if we wrote the code. So if you use something like, say, ASP.NET Web API, which, by the way, we've been embracing things like JSON.NET, which are libraries that were written by the community. James is sitting right here. Where is he? There he is. And you find a bug in JSON.NET, and you're using the JSON.NET version that ships with Web API, we will support that. So when we get behind open source and we start to ship it, we actively agree to support it just as if it's our own stuff. So if you're in a company and you're saying, wow, Web API looks really cool, but I can't use it because now it's open source, you don't have to think about it that way. As long as it is something that we are shipping and that we say we are standing behind, then we will actually support it. And if not, well, then it's open source and you have the community to help you, just as you would if it was something that Microsoft wasn't shipping. So that is really all I wanted to say as far as my experiences around open source and the work that Microsoft is doing. What I wanted to do was really open up. We've got a big room here. I wanted to open up the conversation. I wanted to hear what you guys think about open source and Microsoft. What are the things that you want to see? What are your experiences? And you can be honest. You can say you don't like it. You think there's things we should do differently. But this is your chance, really. So I'd love to have interaction from people from the audience. So who has a, yes? That's a great question that I can't answer. What I can tell you is that the Mono team and Microsoft work together. Mono would not exist without Microsoft supporting it. Microsoft does work with the Mono team. As far as where that's going to go in the future, I really don't know. I have no problem personally with the idea of us working together more tightly with the Mono team. Just out of curiosity, what kind of development are you doing with Mono? Are you doing Xamarin, like iOS type, or Android, or server side?
Well, iOS, writing mobile apps using Mono, and I've also used WebKit actually too on certain applications as well.
Okay.
So I just like doing things more eclectically and not being kind of locked into any one, vendor, so to speak.
I see. So are you asking, is Microsoft going to synergize more?
Yeah, that's what I'm really asking, to synergize C# because when you guys move forward with C# and Mono is kind of like out of sync with you guys, and I'm just wondering whether or not you guys will be more in sync, as C#
Evolves.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I will definitely bring that feedback back. Thank you. I don't have a better answer for you. Anybody else? Anybody have any? Yes.
Hang on. We'll catch the question on the mic so that we get it on the record.
So Microsoft recently announced the end of life for the XNA project, and obviously Xamarin has the Monogame project. It'd be really awesome if Microsoft would help out a bit getting that onto Windows Phone 8. I know there's patches now that just make it work, but like the Microsoft platforms that we're supporting, a bit of Microsoft help would be really appreciated there.
So getting XNA to work on, you said getting XNA to work on Windows Phone?
Monogame is Xamarin's open source version of XNA.
Yeah.
And they have, the community has brought it over to Microsoft's new platforms, but a little bit more help from Microsoft would be really awesome.
Okay, so you'd like to see help from Microsoft getting that to work on Windows Phone.
Yeah.
the open source XNA equivalent. Okay, I'll definitely take that as a note to bring back. So we want to have Mono's game framework on Windows Phone. And we want to know about Mono and C# synergy. All right, what else?
Maybe we've got time for one more question, then we'll
Okay.
wrap up.
Yep.
Sorry.
I know I'm awfully biased, though, but could you do something about system reflection?
Didn't you say you're rewriting it?
I'd rather not, but yeah.
What do you want to see? And is that in the context of open source, or is this just a general request?
I want to see the source code and be able to send pull requests.
Oh, interesting. Nice. So we want the .NET framework all up to accept pull requests. Is that what you're asking?
Pretty much.
Is that a shared desire? How many people here want to actually contribute patches and things to the .NET framework? I will echo that back. I will definitely echo that back.
Works for me. Thank you.
And I think that those kind of things are actually going to start happening. So let me give you a hint on one thing. One of the things that Newget is changing is it's actually changing how we're going to build the framework of the future. So we are actually really exploring a model of where the runtime is very small and everything else is just delivered as Newget packages. Does that sound good? Okay, that's where we're going. All right, I'm getting the warning. I'm getting the boot, actually. Thank you guys very, very much. Enjoy the conference. If you want to talk about Microsoft and open source, I'll be around, and I will see you guys later.